Hi, I'm David Schnese Jacobson. I'm the preaching professor here at Boston University School of Theology and the director of the Homiletical Theology Project. I'd like to welcome you to this, another one of our webinars on homiletical theology. Our guest today is Dr. Adam Hearlson, who is a professor, assistant professor over at Andover Newton Theological Seminary here in the greater Boston area. I'm pleased to welcome him today. Before we do that, though, I want to be sure also to welcome the many people who are attending here today. This particular webinar is being held within the Practical Theology Pro Seminar, so some of the students are participating as participants within that doctoral seminar. Others are students who have an interest in preaching, and really happy to have everyone here as part of the conversation. And if you're watching from afar online, I hope you'll feel free to ask some questions in the chat room as well. So I'll go ahead and ask Johan to start the introductions around the room.
Hello, my name is Johan. I'm in third year PhD program and my concentration is homiletics.
Hello, my name is Duze Lee, second year PhD in homiletics.
My name is Mason Lee. I'm an STM student interested in homiletics.
My name is Graham Hill. I'm a Redemptorist seminarian at Boston College, interested in homiletics too.
My name is Jonathan Rismini. I'm a first-year PhD student here at Boston University School of Theology in Practical Theology and Spirituality.
My name is Jera Gonzalez. I am a practical theologian. I'm a practical theologian. Practical theology doctoral student.
And my name is Chris, and I'm a Doctor of Ministry student here at BU and a pastor of a UCC church on the North Shore.
One reason we're so excited to welcome Dr. Hearlson here today is that he spent a lot of his research, including his dissertation, looking at how theories of practice relate to his work as a homiletician. And I think this is a particularly important opening in the field of homiletical theology right now, so I'm just very pleased to have him here. Adam Hearlson's also been active in publishing, has 2 brand new articles out, one at homiletic.net, and we'll be talking about those 2 articles today. But want to begin by inviting him to tell us a little bit about his research and how it relates to the theories of practice he uses as a homiletician and as a practical theologian in his work, and especially the theory of practice of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. So at this point, I turn it over to Dr. Hearlson to speak about his own research, how he understands himself as a practical theologian, how he does his interdisciplinary work, and how he incorporates the theory of practice of Pierre Bourdieu.
Thanks, David. It's a great pleasure to be here. When I first got to Boston, David was among the first people to reach out to me, and he was also the reader on my dissertation, the outside reader on my dissertation, and has at every turn been such a helpful conversation partner and interlocutor that you sort of need as you continue to swirl around ideas. And when you're in a seminar for most of your PhD and then you're sort of kicked out into the world, it's always nice to have someone else to have a conversation with and recreate these moments of work. I'm going to start something. I'm going to read a poem, all right? This poem has very, very little to do with what I'm going to talk about today, but here's my rationale for the poem, which is it's a totally sublime poem. And if you leave here and you're like, I have no idea what that person was talking about, that poem was really good though. Okay, so listen to this poem. It's called The Rider. It's by Richard Wilbur. If you're familiar with his work, he's a lovely poet. And I have a small child, so if you've got children, this might make you cry. Anyway, it goes like this. The Rider by Richard Wilbur. In her room at the prow of the house where the light breaks and the windows are tossed with linden, my daughter is writing a story. I pause in the stairwell, hearing from her shut door a commotion of typewriter keys, like a chain hauled over a gunwale. Young as she is, the stuff of her life is a great cargo, and some of it heavy. I wish her a lucky passage. But now it is she who pauses, as if to reject my thought and its easy figure. A stillness greatens, in which the whole house seems to be thinking. And then she is at it again with a bunched clamor of strokes, and again is silent. I remember the dazed starling which was trapped in that very room 2 years ago, how we stole in, lifted a sash, and retreated not to affright it. and how for a helpless hour through the cracked door we watched the sleek, wild, dark, and iridescent creature batter against the brilliance, drop like a glove to the hard floor of the desktop, and wait, then, humped and bloody, for the wits to try it again, and how our spirits rose when suddenly sure it lifted off from a chair back, beating a smooth course for the right window and clearing the sill of the world. It is always a matter, my darling, of life or death, as I had forgotten. I wish what I wished you before, but harder. Rider by Richard Wilbur. Now that's a sublime poem. It does have some overlap, and the overlap is this. Practical theology, as I understand it, is not easy. It's really, really difficult in the sense that it demands that you respect practices and the people who do them. When you get a PhD, when you get these letters behind your name, you get these opportunities to be part of the field of practical theology. And it's really important for me, at least in my work, to make a really important distinction. There is the practical theology field. That is the one for which you are credentialed in a PhD program, or for which you get a degree for, and then you do research that, you know, by the degree program tells you is practical theological, okay? Then there are those people who are practicing theology in their daily life every day. You might also be one of those. So you might have these two identities, practical theologian, PhD or whatever, and then practical theologian, person of faith who goes through their life practicing what they believe, and having all manner of different practices that help them understand and make sense of a God that is at once unknowable and immanent. Okay? How do we do that? I don't know. We do that via practice, generally. So I make this distinction between these two things because the assumption of these two groups of people are different, ultimately. And when these two groups of people get conflated, the ideas and the meaning of the practicing community is generally the thing that gets altered by the field of practical theology. The field likes to tell the people what they are doing and why they are doing it. And when it does that, there is a certain amount of hubris and arrogance that can often come along with that if the field recognizes itself as the practical theologians, as those set apart to professionally think about what's happening. It isn't a bad thing that there are these two different fields that are ostensibly both called practical theology. It's not, I mean, it's a little confusing in the end of the day, but for the most part, it's not a bad thing. As long as we continue to recognize that these are two separate things. And I make a similar point in the homiletics article that I gave to you, which is there are homileticians and there are preachers. And these are not the same thing, ultimately. The homiletician is the one studying the preacher. The preacher is the one who steps into the pulpit. It's a great honor and gift and privilege to be able to study those who are doing the practice, but we ought not to confuse that, that we are more important than the one doing the practice. We, in some ways, always serve at the liberty of the people practicing. If we're going to be professional observers of any sort, we have to recognize that the people who are doing this, if they were to go away, we go away. We don't have a job any longer. There's no phenomenon to look at any longer. There's no site of observation. And so, in some ways, we have to enter into their world, initially anyway, on their terms. And so we do a lot of front-end hard work in order to understand what's going on in a way that is both accurate but real in the same way. And then to some extent, because we more or less write to each other, we make sense of that in a way that that follows the proper language and rules of the field itself. So in some ways, we're bouncing back and forth between these two fields. And this is Bourdieu's major idea, is that we as observers are always in this constant danger of putting into the mind of the actors our own professional mind, right? That we believe that they operate with the same assumptions and ideas as we, as scholars do. Okay, this is, and he calls this the intellectualist fallacy. If we were to only do a little bit of self-reflection, we would realize that we actually don't practice a very consistent faith. We do all sorts of different things, and people ask us why, and we say, I don't know, I don't really have a good reason for that. But it's very rare that we have a consistent way of doing things. But as practical theologians, you'll read over and over again, like, oh, this is why they do things, or and this shows up with a lot of people who follow a sort of more thick description Geertzian model. You know, they draw and build a narrative, and that narrative is quite impressive. If you've ever read Geertz, his chapter on the Balinese cockfight, has anyone read it? That's a very famous chapter, and he lays out this a wonderful story about how, you know, he gets granted access into this Balinese cockfight, and he goes to it, and he's hanging out, and it's all men, and suddenly it gets raided by the police, and he runs away with a bunch of other Balinese men, hops a fence, and like hides from the police. And in doing so, he realizes, oh, he's gained some sort of entrance in to see how this world operates. And so then does what he calls a thick description of this Balinese cockfight. And in it, he tells this beautiful narrative of what's happening. And he ends up saying that, you know, the cockfight is for the Balinese, which is a very rigid societal structure where upward mobility or downward mobility is nearly impossible. He says, look, the cockfight is a way where they can rage at this structure without real consequence in their life. That's a lovely conclusion. So the Balinese rage at this structure in the cockfight. Well, I love that idea. When you read it, it's beautifully written, and the story is really quite compelling. Until you start to ask questions like, well, where are the women? So can we really say the Balinese here? Because there's a whole set of people who are missing from this. And then we start to think, oh, there's this whole history of like transnational commerce that's going on within Bali at the time, where the Dutch had colonized it for a long period of time and are the ones who actually outlawed cockfighting. And so you start to pull back the curtain and you realize, oh, this really consistent, beautiful narrative is not really a beautiful, consistent narrative. It really isn't a narrative at all. It's people act towards different ends according to their interests. And it might be that some people want to go to the cockfight because they're entertained, or some people are maybe making money by selling the cocks in a market, and so there's an economic interest involved. I mean, any number of different interests might be involved beyond we're raging at the structure, the rigid societal structure in which we live. So, so when I approach practical theology, I do so doing my very best to just try and understand the practice in all of its messiness and its hurly-burly is sort of the Wittgensteinian word, right? Like it's wild and woolliness. I don't assume that it's going to adhere to any single consistent way of operating in the world, but I enter it trying to figure out what the interest is, why people, why it's gathered people to do the same practice at the same time, but similarly how that practice is itself a source of discord. And this is where my theory of culture, borrowed from Bourdieu, comes in, which is cultures aren't made by consensus, they're made by conflict. You have a bunch of people who enter because they more or less agree on some things, but what gives real shape to the culture is how the disagreement forces them into particular actions, practices, and behaviors. So when I was in your seat, you know, we learned these different practical theological approaches. So you probably read Browning or James Fowler or Gherkin. This is generally classified as like the American hermeneutical approach, right? And very influenced by people like Ricoeur and Gadamer. And so they're taking this hermeneutical approach, and they see things in terms of dialogue. And so they approach practical theology as this dialogue between local practice and theory, and so this theory and practice model is always is trying to talk to each other, right? The questions for someone like Don Browning are arising from the community. They're not inserted from the outside necessarily by practical theologians, but at least they shouldn't be. But the practical theologian is in some ways the courier who grabs this question up and then like poses it to the philosopher or to the sociologist or to the anthropologist or the psychologist or whatever, generally social sciences, but maybe biologist. I don't know. There's all of this. Every time I hear about theology and science right now, people talk about mirror neurons. Do you want to know what a mirror neuron is? I mean, neither do I, but they just keep talking about mirror neurons. I don't know what that is. But so maybe that's important. But so, if you're Browning, you're like, well, maybe this biological fact about a mirror neuron can give us some insight into like some ethical principle in this particular local context. Then there's this sort of neo-Aristotelian approach, right? Largely influenced by the vision of practice in McIntyre, who's trying to wrestle with the idea of virtue in a way that's not immediately metaphysical. And he and his followers later, who build on his ethical principles, people like Hearlson October and others, are looking at his idea of virtue and seeing that virtue arises out of community. It's taught via the community. And it's taught not in some sort of didactic way, but in practice. You become part of the community by doing it. And in that doing, and this is the Aristotelian side, you learn something. Learn something that you couldn't ever learn if you didn't actually practice it. And then you have these other postmodernists like Elaine Graham and Rebecca Chopp and Mary Fulkerson, and they're basically saying, these normative categories that we use for theology actually aren't all that helpful. Theological norms need to arise from the community themselves. So if you read Mary Fulkerson's work, her book, Spaces, something about places.
Places of Redemption.
Places of Redemption. It's a fabulous book, in part because she puts her money where her mouth is in some sense, and she says, okay, so I believe that the theological principles need to arise from a community. So she embeds herself in an ethnographic study of a particular community in the rural hills of North Carolina, and she sees the ways in which they do theology on the ground, and then builds some principles about what that means. And she has this wonderful space where she talks about wounds. Like you do, theology is done from a wound, and so if you find those sites, that's when you find what people are interested in, because wounds are the sites that will congregate attention. So I learned all of these schools. I read these books. And then I read Bourdieu, and he was sort of uninterested in schools to begin with, if that makes any sense. This idea that there would be a particular method that you would adhere to seemed kind of crazy to him. In part because if we're going to go into these local places, importing external methods is already beginning to shade the argument one way, to shade the data a specific way. We're already making sense. We're already importing this theoretical understanding of what's happening here in a way that is going to program a certain result. And so Bourdieu says, no, every social field has its own practical logic, is what he calls it. They make sense their own way. And it might look very similar to the field next to it, but it's not identical. You might learn a lot by studying PhD students at Boston University and then go over to Harvard University and realize, oh, these students look really similar. And the temptation would be to say, well, now I know a lot about doctoral students in Boston. And Bourdieu would say, no, you don't. You know about this particular set, this group of people, and this group of people, and they're different ultimately, because they are operating in different structures and in different systems, in different fields. If you wanted to talk about doctoral students in Boston, well, now that's a different question. And so then, all of this to say is that Bourdieu is what I call a pragmatic methodological pluralist. Whatever works. He walks in and says, today I'm a neo-Aristotelian. Tomorrow I'm a American hermeneutical approach. It doesn't matter. But he needs to know the contours of the field before he can even make that decision. And similarly, I agree with this, which is I live in a time where when I was sitting in your seat, I had teachers and they asked me, what's your practical theological method? And I said, well, it's very much like Rebecca Chopin, it's very much like Mary Fulkerson. And then they said, all right, there's your grade. And I was like, all right, I got my grade. And then I graduated and they gave me a PhD. And then no one ever asked me this again. And
Don't tell them that.
Until I arrived here.
Keep it quiet.
But it was really important that I make that first decision. Because now I'm at a place where, having sort of gone through that and thought really intentionally about what each of these can offer, I'm at a better place to sort of Frankenstein them together when I'm in a new place. And so when I talk about my own practical theological method, and I'm going to wrap up here in a second, I think about it in terms of bricolage. So Claude Lévi-Strauss is this social scientist, right? And in his book, The Mind of the Savage, he makes this distinction between the engineer and the bricoleur. And the engineer, he venerates and says the engineer can look at an outside problem and fashion something specifically for that. He says most of history, it was just bricoleurs. They had to take what was existing in their experience and refashion it. Nothing was ready-made, so you had to sort of like duct tape and baling wire solutions to new problems that would arise. And he sees this progress into this world of engineering as a great asset of Western civilization in many ways. I'm not so sure, ultimately, because it's really difficult, for one, and I'm not smart enough to be the engineer, and I need to experiment. So much of practical theology, at least to me, is getting in the mix of the field, the people, the practice, looking at it, trying to figure out what it is, and then fashioning something from something else that I already had. And then refashioning it and trying to make it work until I feel like I've got it. The benefits of this type of idea, especially when it comes to sort of method and theory, is it allows us to account for time. And time is this great problem to have, because time changes things. Just over time, things change, and we don't have a lot of control over how things change. So if we build this beautiful product, and we're like, look, we're going to put it here. Look, it's this beautiful vision of what this thing is, and 2 weeks later, what that thing doesn't exist any longer. And so with practical theology, this is the final point. Over and apart the other social sciences, I plan on aiding communities. Part of my job as a practical theologian in the field is to come into these among the other practical theologians who are actually practicing and help them. And if I don't help them, then I need to leave. Practical theology has a prescriptive part of it. And that's hard. I mean, we need to be humble. We need to really, really be humble with that fact, because Oftentimes we can confuse our own self-interest for the interest of the group, and think, oh, they just need what I would need, which is like more theology generally, but really maybe they need something else. So helping them provide some aid and help, it brings some normative categories back into the equation, which is complicates things, but is important. With regard to interdisciplinary work, I take whatever. It's some days it's correlational, like Tillich and I are just like buddied up, and we're gonna like, I got theological questions, and he's got and these social sciences have answers. Great, okay, that works. Some days it's I just grab willy-nilly. I don't really have a method for it. In part because this is the pragmatic side of things, where I'm trying to allow the social space to dictate what the method is, and in doing so, I try not to import the interdisciplinary. I can't help it. It's gonna happen. It does. I am a product of an academy, and they've taught me to do things a very specific way. It's not like I stray too far afield of that training, but I really do my best to try and pull back and allow the space to dictate what's going on. And that becomes really important in homiletics as I practice it, which is I'm interested in looking at this phenomenon of preaching in its context. Not singularly removed from a context, but recognizing this singular practice in the whole array of practices in which it's embedded. So preaching doesn't happen in isolation. It doesn't happen by itself. It happens before a bunch of practices and after a bunch of practices. And so to just focus on that preaching is to, in some ways, ignore these other practices that are already shifting what preaching means to these people. So I'm more interested in pulling back and starting at the wound, like Mary Fulkerson says, and finding where it attaches to preaching. And then there I hang out. But I start somewhere far off, in part because if I start just at preaching, I might see really significant things in the preaching practice of a group of people and say, wow, that's so important. And it might actually bear no influence on them. But I see it as important because I'm interested in seeing it as important, because I'm a homiletician and I'd like to write a paper, and I'd like to get that paper published. And I'd like other people to invite me to their classrooms and listen to me. I mean, I have the whole host of self-interest that I bring into my own job and my own work. And I'd like to say that those don't influence me, but they do. And so I'm always wrestling with that move, and that's the reflexivity part, which is like, who's standing to gain here? What's at stake here? Is there more at stake for me being right or wrong than the people who I'm trying to aid and help? Well, that's a troubling thought. So beginning to think about how all of those swirl is complex. And so again, back to the poem. Part of me wants to be the father that comes in and says, like, I wish you easy passage. I wish you a practical theology that's simple, where the ideas come naturally and just sort of spring out of thin air and they're influential forever. But I realize that some of the most exciting work that I've done, at least for me, not talking about what other people have received it as, but for me, the thing that drives me, whether or not people read it or not, is the stuff that comes from the hard, messy places. And when you root around in there and you get in the dirt and you're knee deep in it and you think, man, there's something wild here. There's something really true and valuable, and I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to articulate it. And someday, maybe, hopefully, with God's help, I'll be able to do it. But for now, I'm just going to be happy right here, where it's hard and it's difficult to understand, and you know, that's why I got into this in the beginning. It wasn't to make $1 million. That's not happening. And it's not to be esteemed in an academy or something like that. It's because I saw God in practice once, and I want to go back to that, and I want to be around people who are doing it. And this is a life that allowed me to do that. And to the extent that I then get to go and have interesting critical conversations about it with other smart people, what a blessing and privilege that is. What a remarkable miracle that such a position exists in the world, that I would be able to like go and experience this stuff again, anew, afresh, and then go and talk to smart people like you and say, can you believe that? That's amazing. But that's how I enter this. I mean, I know that you all have read some of the stuff that I've written recently, both about texts and congregations, and both about the influence of Bourdieu on my own understanding of homiletics. But I'm interested in what you're thinking. What about this notion of practice as Bourdieu has given, and I've given you a little slice of that, is intriguing to you, is interesting to you? What do you, take me through. What's bumping around in your brain?
While we're waiting, I want to be sure to also welcome Timothy Jones, who's with us in the chat room. And
oh, Tim, what's up?
Yeah. So if Tim or any of the other guests in the chat room would like to offer questions, they're also welcome to do so. So let's start with the theories of practice, and specifically looking at Bourdieu. Any questions at all about that, whether clarifying or just elaborating further?
I just understand what you were talking about. Letting the field dictate the method. How do you go about choosing the right method for each of those questions that are brought up?
Okay, yeah, this is an important question. So Bourdieu often gets accused of having of being sort of like, oh, you just sort of show up and choose it, and everyone's like, yeah, but you're really smart. Like, easy for you to say, right? But he does have some immutable laws, which is he wants that reflexive move, and so he builds his social understandings around that reflexivity centrally. So rather than being a check on a method, it is the beginning of the method. Okay. You start with what you got, more or less, and whatever, and you are constantly asking critical questions about whether or not this is a helpful tool for observation. The criteria that I think he would ultimately use, and whether or not you want to use this as your criteria, I think it's up to you. But he's interested in a couple of sites where he's going to constantly look. He's going to look at the boundaries of the field. That idea of field is very central to him. What does it take to gain entry into the field? For instance, what's the fee? Because you don't enter a social site without paying something. And it might be allegiance to a specific idea or set of ideas. It might be that you have to have a particular worldview. You know, in some places it might mean like economic capital. Like you want to be part of a country club? Well, pony up, you know? But there's always a fee. There's always something that you have to agree to. And in most fields, that fee will go undiscussed because it's assumed that everybody has it. That's the entry fee. So for instance, if you watch right-wing television and you watch left-wing television, they're in the same field of like talking head media punditry, okay? They all agreed that this is worth talking about. That's part of the fee for arriving. Now, why it's worth talking about, you know, because they're getting big fat paychecks or because they think that there's actual important issues at stake, whatever. But you won't generally see people question the existence of the field to begin with. And Bourdieu says, well, okay, so this is an important site to look at first. What's the entry fee? What do people have to have in order to be part of this field? 2, where are the places of discord? Central issues of conflict. He wants you to look at those, because there you're going to see where the fee begins to split, where the group itself begins to stratify, and generally is going to stratify into hierarchies of power. And so those hierarchies of power are going to be really important. And generally, he says that in any field, there's going to be 3 more or less groups, and they each have different strategies. There are those who have the most power, and he likens it to like a card table where you're playing a poker game. He's like, there are those who have big stacks of chips. They're the powerful. And those chips are a long history. I mean, those are history on display. You've seen, these are people who have accrued capital over long periods of time, and in those chips you see a historical record. Those people who are powerful, they have, they're by and large, he doesn't believe in rules, he believes in regularities. By and large, those people are going to favor strategies of conservation. They want to conserve the status quo as it's, because, you know, it's been really helpful for them. They've got all of this money, capital. So there's this other group, and this is generally who the powerful are playing against. And those are people with small stacks of chips, but chips, you know, they've got a little bit of capital. And the people over here, they generally favor strategies of succession. They're waiting basically for these people to die so that they can then take their seat. And then Bourdieu says there's a final group, and they're not at the table, and they're not granted access to the table. And those are the powerless. They have very little capital to speak of to begin with. And he says those people, they favor strategies of subversion. And the subversive strategies of those people are not immediately, how do I gain those chips? The subversive strategies are, how do I ruin this game? How do I refigure the capital so that what I have is valuable and what they have is worthless? How do I flip this table over so it's spread out all over the place so no one knows whose is what? So those are the subversive ideas are in the cracks, and you don't. The thing is the powerful never hear about it because they're constantly building this status quo that tells the people without power that the reason that they don't have power is because they don't know how to handle it. In your hands, you wouldn't be able. It's just a condescending way of saying like, and so the strategy of the power is to make those without power love the inevitable. And so by loving the inevitable, they believe this is the way things always have been, and this is the way things always will be. And Bourdieu says, but there are times when those powerless folk can refigure things. And so, in one of his essays, he was part of one of the écoliers in Paris during the '68 riots, student riots, and he would hear these students marching in the street. He's a big professor, right? And they're all marching, and they and he says that they storm language, and he's making this a really sort of witty play on the French Revolution when they stormed the Bastille, and saying, no, these students are storming language, and they're refiguring what the dominant symbols are, and in doing so, they are changing the power dynamics of a particular place. So he says, look at those places of capital. Who's got, and then try and decipher what their interest is, because all action is interested, and this is another important part about Bourdieu, is he's going to say, there's no such thing as disinterested action. Even our disinterest is interested. Like, I want to look cool, so I'm like, I don't care, you know. But I have an interest in my own, in being seen as disinterested. So he doesn't believe in disinterested action, and we're all interested. What is the interest? And the other problem is that most people don't totally know what the interest is because it's been handed to them.
Right.
And this is the final piece. This is that habitus piece,
Right.
which is we have all of these assumptions and ideas about what's normative and what's important and what's valuable in the world, and those have been handed to us, and we bear them in our body and we bear them in our practice, but we struggle to actually note where they come from or who handed them to us. Foucault has a similar idea, and he says something like, most people know what they do. Some of them know why they do it. But what people don't know is what they do does. We have very little insight into how the deep consequences of our actions spread like deep into the future, and how they've been handed from far in the past, so that the practices of marriage, for instance, right? Like marriage, why do we do this? I don't know. Like, I love my wife. I really do. I love my wife, and I wanted to marry her. I don't know why. I mean, I've got this history, this religious tradition that's telling me that this is a good thing, and I agree with that. I have a social milieu of which I'm a part, where being married is important. It brings me capital, right? So that I walk into places and I have a wife and I think that she's pretty cool, and other people think that she's pretty cool, and so then that reflects good on me. So there's all sorts of my own self-interest wrapped up in this, but there's also social interest wrapped up in this. You know, the procreation of children is good for society overall. Marriages look really different at different times in this world, and marriage rights, you know, for most of human history have been property, issues of property. They're no longer. In some places they still are, in some places, but those vestiges still exist. Like, I still gain capital by being married. It's not money, it's not a dowry, it's not, but it is legitimacy in some sense. It's all sorts of other things beyond the intrinsic good of love, for instance, right? And love is an intrinsic good, and I would agree with that. And I love my wife, and doing a solemn commitment to her in public and for God and friends is important. But that's not to also belittle the fact that, like, my social existence is made better through marriage. So you start at those places, and then you look at field, you look at capital, and you look at habitus. Those are the three sort of places where he's going to keep looking, and then trying to fashion a vision of what's happening. And when we think about that in practice, you know, you look at, you know, what is the preaching tradition? I'll use this in a homiletical way. What is the preaching tradition that's been handed down to him? Like, what's the vision of the preacher within the larger hierarchy of the culture in which people live? What's valuable? What's seen as valuable in the preaching? Not just the message, but the tone, the look, the ideas, the worldview. Then what kind of unique capital does the preacher have in a particular group of people? I served a church where the preacher was well regarded as a moral, ethical teacher, and everyone loved him. He also happened to come from a family background where he had more money than he knew what to do with. You know, he didn't need the job, but he was there. But he never once thought that buying a nice car would be a good thing, because he was afraid that if he was seen in a nice car, it would belittle his role as the preacher. People would stop listening to him. So he drove this junky car around. Similarly, I've been in other places where preachers are poor as church mice, but they've got this huge car bill in order to be seen as prestigious in a local community. So what are the signs of capital that are used? I mean, a junky car is still a sign of capital. It's just a different type of capital. It's this idea of humility that is really important in order to adhere to this role. So with all of those things, you're looking at this this triad and this interchange of these relational pieces and how it's all fitting together. And Bourdieu basically says you'll find the best vision of that if you look at the places of conflict.
We're in our last 10 minutes here, and I just want to jump in here for a second. First of all, I'll give a shout out to Darren Stylianopoulos, who's participating. Darren is an MDiv student.
Hey, Darren.
And quite a good preacher who is listening in on our exchange today, so welcome to her as well. And we're also at the end of class time, so of course some of you may need to leave at some point, but we'll be continuing until 5 o'clock for those of you who wish to remain. I think I'd like to turn and think a little bit about the two articles that Dr. Hearlson sent to us to look at. So we've been talking broadly about Pierre Bourdieu's theory of practice and what that might mean for practical theology. But these two texts actually deal very specifically with elements in homiletics, the idea of our congregation's text, which goes back to a lot of the material you're going into with Gertz, which is that in homiletics, when we talk about context, it's tempting sometimes to speak in rather univocal terms of context, as embodying a sort of a finished and complete worldview, rather than to see context more complexly. And it seems to me your work helps to complexify how we look at context. And I want to thank you for that today.
Well, I appreciate that.
But I think that's important because this is also where a lot of the research is heading. And I think of people like Anju Mary Kim who talk about globalization in context, for example. So I think just to kind of launch off this section, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about your research there and how your work with Bourdieu's theory of practice influences the way we think about contexts and congregations, whether we're homileticians or practical theologians.
Sure. So my struggle is what are the effective metaphors that we might use for congregations? And what I was finding when I was doing so much reading in homiletics was that the default tended to be this idea of text, and that had come out of this the hermeneutics of the 60s and 70s, particularly Gadamer and Ricoeur, but and they had a huge influence on anthropology, especially in the 70s and 80s, mainly with Clifford Geertz, who was an anthropologist who taught at Princeton University and then later at the Institute for Advanced Study, which was also in Princeton. And Geertz had this idea of thick description that is really quite compelling, but tends to, like you said, David, see things in univocal terms. And later in his career, he started to say, he tried to complexify that a little bit, in part because I think his work in less capable hands became really monolithic, you know? This is who people are. What Bourdieu brings is this idea that social groups are not monolithic. In fact, they're very diverse, and they're fighting with each other tooth and nail. If we don't see them fighting, and Bourdieu is saying you've not looked in the right places, which is its own sort of tautology, but there's something to this in the sense that when he paints those people who are disenfranchised, the likelihood of the powerful hearing them is very low, in part because they've hidden their speech. So they're not a text. There's nothing written down. There's nothing legible that they've put out into public that gives you some insight into who they are and what their practices are. So you have to go and find those sites or gain entry by some way in order to see these hidden practices that exist, especially among the disenfranchised, the marginal, and the oppressed. And so this got me thinking just about how do we look? How do we look well? And Geertz would say look for the public symbols, and I'm more on the using Bourdieu, look for those backroom conversations. Those will give you greater insight into what a congregation is, because it's easy to see the public party line that's always present. But seeing, and then there is a sort of a middle ground of infrapolitics where there's where the disenfranchised and the oppressed will speak in semi-coded language within public when in the company of powerful people. You know this. You know when you're in classes with professors, you talk slightly differently than when your classes only with students. You know, those conversations take on different tenors. And so, from the Geersian standpoint, I wasn't satisfied with the way that the powerful and the oppressed and disenfranchised were seen as a cohesive whole. And so I was thinking, okay, so what's the problem here? Well, there's this monolithic problem. There's this problem of the researcher himself or herself who goes in and believes that they've seen this whole thing, when really what you see is their vision of a place. So it's your third remove. If you read anthropology and if you read these ideas of congregations, you're not seeing the reality, you're seeing the reality of the notebook in which the notes were written. You're not seeing the whole thing, because at some point the person made a decision about what to get put in and what to leave out. And those are hard decisions, and to the extent that they've made them, we try and trust those researchers as having some integrity and character to choose wisely. But we should be under no impression that this is the whole story. In my own research, I'm more interested in those backroom conversations. And I actually think that that's some of the best sermons are being preached like back there. Some of the most important sermons in the congregations happen in the back. And finally, they're not text. They're not legible in the same way that, you know, we have, if you read a history of preaching, for instance, right? Great preachers of New England, right? You might get an Anne Hutchinson sermon somewhere, but most of them, you're just going to get the people who had their sermons written down at some point. There's a whole bunch of other people who are preaching things that we never get a chance to even read. And those folk might provide a really different story. Similarly, when we go into our congregations, we listen to what the preacher is saying. There's no guarantee what the preacher is saying is what's being mimicked in the back. Moreover, what's being mimicked in the back might not actually be in words. And this is the text part that's different, is that that what Bourdieu and others, and this is where his colleague in France, Michel Desserteau, it becomes important, because Desserteau says, look, you stop looking for language. You've looked for words. But if you want to know what's happening, listen. Listen for cries, listen for moans, listen for different sounds than you're used to. And that will lead you to the places.
Theology begins with a wound.
Yeah, exactly. You listen to the places where it's, you know, where there's deep laughter that you've never heard before. Well, go there. Or the person who's crying, like, go there. Those are where preaching is happening. Those are where the practices of the church are happening that don't get a lot of observation. Those are so Certeau is basically saying, like, we've privileged this vision of text and words and what's been written down and what's available, but there's all sorts of hidden sound around us. And if we stop looking and start listening better, we'll actually begin to find our ways into sites that we didn't know existed and actually haven't been written down for any posterity. Because if they were to be written down, they would be used against them and for the purposes of further oppression and disenfranchisement.
We have reached the end of our time together, at least the official time. But I want to first offer some words of thanks. One special thanks, by the way, to Chad Kidd, who's also participating in the chat room today. I didn't realize it until he identified himself. Chad Kidd is a chaplain and the choir director here at BU School of Theology and an all-around Renaissance man. So really happy to have you on board, Chad. Thanks for coming. But I want to thank all of you for participating in this discussion today and thinking deeply about how this unique theory of practice might influence the way we do our work. But most of all, to thank my colleague, Dr. Hearlson, for coming and talking about his work so we could hear about his work as a researcher and how he also views all these important theories relative to the work of homiletics. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.